Tell me, what happens when you combine the loose conversational tone of a podcast with some of the wackiest and most out there episodes of Adventure Time? You get the Midnight Gospel. One of the weirdest, but also I think one of the best new shows that Netflix has to offer. The show follows Clancy as he uses his Advanced Universe Simulator to find people to interview for his podcast. Each episode sees Clancy travel to a different simulated world where he meets someone that he can interview about stuff like drugs, meditation, Buddhism, death, and the people he finds can range from all sorts of varied backgrounds such as knights, deer dog creatures, fish captains, and even Death. Yes, Death herself is a guest on Clancy's show.
You're gonna die after stepping on a ping pong ball.
I think the best way to describe the Midnight Gospel would be that it's a grounded take on a surrealist show, not unlike a lot of the bizarre stuff that plays on late night Adult Swim. You know, shows where things just sort of happen without much build-up or explanation, which can easily make someone uncomfortable and or scared watching it because it's just hard to follow what the hell is going on. I guess to put it simply, drug trips really aren't fun, but thankfully, unlike those shows, the Midnight Gospel does a lot of really clever things to remain grounded and prevent itself from alienating new viewers with its surrealness. Let's look at the first episode to understand why. Now, in later episodes, the show can get pretty insane, but to stop things from getting too crazy too quick, they made sure to keep the majority of the first episode familiar and relatable. And so Clancy's first visit to a simulated planet is to one that's based on Earth, rather than some kind of alien world, because we all know what Earth is like, and so it's not too hard to quickly adjust to the setting. Plus, the main conflict is a take on a zombie apocalypse, which is a type of story that we're all well familiar with, and again, is very easy to grasp. And you see, by starting the show with these familiar concepts, it allows the viewer to more easily accept the much weirder worlds and ideas that appear later on, which is showcased in episode 2, where the show takes some elements that we're familiar with, and then mixes them with completely new ideas, again helping the viewer to gradually accept these strange concepts until we finally get to episode 3, which is all strangeness with little familiarity, but it works because the show builds you up to that point. You have to ease into it. If we were to start the show on episode 3, it would raise way too many questions at once, both about what's happening and what's being discussed, before the viewer even gets a feel for the style of the dialogue and the animation themselves, which through the use of simpler concepts are made much easier to get a grip on. And another thing that helps the Midnight Gospel stay grounded is its clever framing device. Before we enter Zombie Earth, we get to briefly meet our main character, Clancy, and learn that the world we're about to enter is part of his advanced simulation machine. We see Clancy picking worlds, we see him choosing an avatar, and it all functions in service to establishing that the world we're about to enter, and by extension future worlds, are detached from reality, which is why they're all so weird. If we had started the episode already in the virtual world without establishing that it's a sim first, it probably would have been a bit much. Not to mention that the fact that everything is a simulation also explains why Clancy consistently seems so unconcerned about his own safety while he's in there, since to him it's just like a game and he's not actually in danger. So he approaches most of the stuff he sees with an observer's attitude rather than getting scared.
You're all knotted up in my boy's soul string here.
Huh.
I guess that means you'll be coming along for the ride every time Bob dies.
Cool.
And speaking of whom, before entering the simulator in each episode, Clancy picks a new avatar every time, which each come in all sorts of weird shapes and sizes. And so to go along with the theme of familiarity for the first episode, the avatar he picks is a humanoid one. And then in episode 2, they put a twist on the avatar concept by making Clancy's next form this stupid thing, which Clancy accidentally downloaded after getting a virus. And while we're on that note, I'm also a really big fan of Clancy's character design in general, and the way they shuffle it around for each of his avatars. Clancy has grayish purple hair, pink skin, wears a red skirt, and a purple hat with a magenta gradient, which is a color scheme that has a lot of red in it, but then to prevent the design from looking too plain, Clancy has these big, bright green eyes, which contrasts with all the red and really makes the design pop. And then whenever Clancy enters the sim, his avatar will always either have his palette, his basic shape, or his iconic hat, which is such a refreshing take on the game avatar idea. I'd actually be kind of excited to see what new creative avatars they could come up with if the shows were new for another season. It's always fun to see different interpretations of the same basic design, but of course, Midnight Gospel's greatest strength lies in the chill, relaxed tone of its dialogue.
So, just to be clear, you're saying it's not like you're supposed to shove some kind of butt plug in the asshole of your mind.
Shoving a butt plug in the asshole of your mind.
But corking up that part, that idea of corking, it's not that the idea, it seems more like it's accepting there's this infinite swarm of thoughts, and that by understanding that you're not necessarily as connected to them as you thought, it allows...
Which is what this is talking about.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have to kind of grasp and dwell on that as the only solution for continuing to be alive.
Wow.
There's other option, which is to use the sense percept to arrive back at the present.
I get it. I'm enlightened now.
Now, most dialogue in shows aren't exactly what you'd call natural, so to speak. The dialogue is written by a writer and is then given to some actors to perform it, which is a pretty big departure from a naturally occurring conversation. Now, of course, this is important for drama and comedy, but it also means missing out on some of the small nuances of conversation that add authenticity to it. Stuff like stuttering, forgetting words, taking time to breathe, people somewhat talking over, interrupting each other, mumbling, small comments, and most of all, laughing. The Midnight Gospel keeps all of that stuff in, since they're all very important to selling the podcast-like vibe. And nothing is more relatable than two characters just hanging out and talking, which is why I describe the show as being surreal, yet grounded. No matter how crazy the visuals or the plot might get, no matter how many wrenches are thrown into the mix, you can always count on the characters talking like real people would in the real world.
You're very... How old are you? Do you mind my asking?
44.
Are you really? God, you are so great looking. You have beautiful skin. It's a blessing. There's no reason to feel embarrassed. It's a blessing. I think probably God just loves you more than other people.
Oh,
that's how the, yeah. That's how it works. That's the Christian path.
Because
yeah.
there is a hierarchical
There
love
is.
with
There
God,
definitely
right?
is.
That's
But you may get a much nicer seat in heaven because of it too, like near the dessert table or the cheeses.
You're not fooling me.
No, it's
the
true.
cheese, yes.
The cheese and the baguettes.
This is the kind of stuff I'd love to see more of in surrealist shows. Like, a lot of them just focus on showing you a bad trip, but the Midnight Gospel feels very dreamlike. It blurs the lines of reality in a mesmerizing way and delivers an experience that's really relaxing and even comforting to watch and listen to. It's really easy to just get sucked in. When a character laughs, it's hard not to laugh along with them, and when an emotional moment hits, it's hard not to be taken by it. Though, the down-to-earth nature of this show can also be quite comedic at times. Like, in episode 2, Clancy and the steer dog are in a cart that's headed toward a slaughterhouse, but then Clancy needs to use the bathroom, so they leave the cart to go do that, and then when they're done, they go back onto the cart! What are you doing? This scene is the epitome of,
"Here, hold this." Thanks.
the characters are just like, yeah, this might as well happen. And as a result, the current looser version of this show ends up being way funnier than the more heavily scripted version could ever be.
Have somebody pressed my face in the mirror and said, is it going to be good or bad? I think it might end up being kind of not so good for people, but so I'll deal with it. My profession will deal with it. It's okay. Maybe it will end up being good. I don't. What? Can't you see I'm doing an interview with?
My name's Clancy.
I gotta get back to Clancy here.
Zombies are inside the perimeter.
Just get me a rifle. I'll take care of it.
However, all that does come with a drawback, and that's that whenever the immersion breaks, it breaks hard. Episode 3 is the first time that this happens, at least for me, because unlike the previous two episodes where Clancy and his guests were somewhat divorced from the main conflict as far as the story went, here the guest is in the middle of doing his own thing, as in they are the one pushing the story forward, and so often the conversation will be interrupted in service of doing that. And then when the interruption is over, the conversation will just start up again as if nothing happened.
Too bad. I love them. They are annoying, though.
Ooh, those are some bad fish.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have very many friends just because magic is my life.
For sure.
Not to mention, there were a few other smaller things that raised my brow a bit, such as a couple moments where Clancy says something and Daryl the fish guy wouldn't even notice or would just ignore him, and especially this line.
Someone coming from my background, you know, just poor white trash from Arkansas who has no connection to, you know, any Eastern tradition at all.
Tell me, are we on Earth? Where is Arkansas? This was when I realized that the show wasn't just in the style of a podcast, it actually was a podcast. Specifically the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, hosted by one of the creators of the show who also voices Clancy. And the whole idea was that they would take episodes of the podcast and then adapt them into animation by masking any cut parts with newly recorded lines or set pieces in the story. All those times that the guest stops talking to Clancy, they're sneaking in a cut. And knowing this explains all the oddities that crop up during the series, such as why Daryl ignores some of the things that Clancy would say, because that audio is stuck in time and there's no way he could have reacted to something that was likely recorded years after the fact, and why he here recounts his time living in Arkansas when that's likely not a real place in this particular simulated world, because that memory belongs to the real person who said that on the podcast and not this fictional character. And once I found all that out, I started seeing it everywhere. Every time the guest refers to Clancy by name, that's a new line. Every time they mention something related to the story, like zombies, that's a new line. And in episode 4, it gets really out of hand, as there are several parts dedicated to just trying to set up this story of revenge, even though that's not nearly as interesting as the low-key dialogues that define the show. Now, of course, I'm not saying that a bigger focus on plot by itself is bad, just that the switching between story focus and real talk gets in the way of showing us both. For instance, in episode 6, we actually don't enter the simulator until rather late into the episode, and as such, up until that point, the episode is completely story-oriented and saves the entirety of the conversation piece until the end. Meanwhile, in episode 4, they're trying to do the story and the conversation simultaneously, which leads to a lot of bothersome interruptions. And the thing is, the story doesn't have to halt the dialogue because the show's visual storytelling is good enough that we can figure out what's going on just by watching it unfold. Episode 2 is a great example of this. During this episode, we learn the following. In this world, there exist little clown creatures, as well as deer dog creatures, which are the natural predators of the clowns. However, bigger clowns actually capture these deer dogs and process them into meat. But then it's revealed that these clown things are actually parasites and have usurped humanity. They capture the deer dogs so that they can rescue any baby clowns that might have been ingested, as well as for the purpose of slaughtering their only predators. Meanwhile, the rest of humanity is kept in the dark about the true nature of the clowns so that the jelly parasites don't run out of suitable hosts anytime soon, thus creating a strange, meat-based dystopia. But then a resistance group starts to form who wear masks that protect them from getting head-crabbed. And during the episode, they plant a bomb in the bathroom of the slaughterhouse in an effort to put an end to the evil clown regime, which then blows up during the climax, and then during the resulting scuffle, we see the clowns collecting dead resistance members the same way they collect the deer dogs, implying that the smiley-faced monsters actually process human beings into meat as well. You see, very little of what I just said is expressly told to us. All of this stuff is what you can infer from just watching what's going on in the background while Clancy and his guests focus on the interview. They didn't need to include a scene where the leader of the resistance gives a speech or goes into detail about how the clowns took over, because all you need are the visuals to tell you that the clowns are evil and that there's a human uprising. And going back to episode 4, knowing that most of these lines are repurposed bits from a real podcast, it's clear that some of these extended scripted sections were put in because they didn't know how else to cut the line. I imagine the kind of dilemmas they must have faced were that they could either cut the line so that it's a minute too short, or cut the line so that it's a minute too long. Yeah, rock in a hard place and all, though it really does hurt this episode in the long run. And while it is pretty common throughout the show for there to be breaks in the conversation, I really am impressed at how well they're able to hide it most of the time, especially since a lot of the new lines had to have been recorded years after the various podcasts that each episode is based on. And when you compare the audio side by side, you can easily see how well it was touched up for the show.
Right, Hinduism and Buddhism are seen as create this like psychedelic megazord.
What?
And or what's that called in Power Rangers?
Oh, okay, cool. Damn it. God, I'm glad it's Power Rangers, but I was praying that you had just added to my lexicon of some fucking new spiritual term called Megazord.
Power Rangers, yeah.
Oh yeah, and given that this is a show exclusive to Netflix, which just literally does not censor stuff, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to issue a weirdness warning. This series can get gross at times. It is an adult show after all. And once again, episode 4 is a pretty big offender of this. If this kind of thing bothers you at all, it might be wise to skip that one. Or like, close your eyes and use your imagination. As for the rest of the show, the gross stuff is thankfully often kept brief, and I only ever had to truly look away once during the middle of the final episode. Trust me, you'll know the moment when you see it. Red flags and alarms will be going off like crazy. So yeah, viewer discretion is advised. This show is not as tame as, say, Adventure Time, even if Pendleton Ward did create both shows. And yeah, you can certainly see a lot of Adventure Time influence here, both in the tone and the animation. When Adventure Time started out, it was this wacky world filled with all kinds of crazy characters, but as it went on, it gradually mellowed out and began to delve into much deeper concepts and philosophies, leading to episodes where there wouldn't even be a monster to fight, which I theorized was because of how the main character Finch started the show as a naive, energetic kid, but then gradually grew up over the course of the series, ending the show as a mature teen, who would come to realize that simply hanging out with friends can be just as enjoyable as going on a grand adventure.
Hey, bud.
The Midnight Gospel feels like a natural evolution of that feeling from the latter half of Adventure Time, now with a much heavier focus on themes, abstract ideas, and contemplating the nature of existence.
Most people spend their lives complaining about things they don't like.
Yes.
So you're adding power to it. You're giving it chi. We're supposed to focus on what it is that we're wanting to move towards instead of away from. You don't have to lie when something is bad. You know, if you have a cold and someone says, "Are you sick?" That doesn't mean say no. It means say, I'm getting better minute by minute.
Oh, that's great.
As for the animation, I would describe it as being a better version of those really trippy guest animated episodes of Adventure Time. You get to see this large variety of crazy creative visuals where something is always happening, and the visuals can get really wicked at times. I mean, come on, are you seeing this meat animation? It's incredible! The way it moves around yet keeps its form as it continues to twist and contort, in addition to commanding your attention while all this other stuff is happening in the background. And it's nothing short of insane just how many background gags and little details they were able to sneak into each episode. The way they just throw everything at the wall animation-wise to fit the dialogue in every possible way moment by moment gives me a lot of GameGrumps animated vibes.
And I'm like, spinach, and then they just fucking destroy it with spinach, just like an avalanche of spinach. And you're like, I want like 5 other things. You can't just fill it up with spinach and think that's all it's gonna be.
Actually, when you think about it, this show is technically just cropped recordings put to animation, so you could argue that this is like if one of those videos were made into a full show, in spirit at least. Although on the other hand, whether this was an intentional choice or a budgetary/time decision, the animation can also be pretty choppy at times. For the most part it's okay, but sometimes it's really noticeable, and I think this show really could have benefited from one of those programs that add frames of animation or however those work. I'm no scientist. But aside from the animation, I really love the palette for this show. There are all these really creative uses of color. There's one episode where Clancy travels to a completely blank planet, but then enters his impossibly spacious bag to discover an extremely vibrant world in there where everything is a soft gradient over it, which of course is then contrasted by Clancy being made entirely of bright hues, while his guest, Death, is composed solely of dark colors. Oh, and by the way, I love the way that she's animated too. This version of Death is adorable.
Anyone up for a game of basketball? No. Baseball? No. Ping pong. No.
Oh yeah, and the background art is also great. It really goes the extra mile as far as making each world feel distinct and memorable. The forest in episode 4 manages to be dark while still featuring these vibrant reds, greens, and magentas. These wicked combinations of solid shapes and symbols litter the clown world as though it's all just one large big top tent. The meditation world consists mostly of blues and yellows, giving the feeling of a tender, relaxing sunrise. Even Earth from episode 1 is extraordinarily colorful and vibrant. The backgrounds almost look like one of those magic eye dot paintings at times. They do an amazing job at achieving this surreal vibe in the most subtle way possible, especially when most other attempts at surrealism just constantly try to throw colors in your face. Like I said, the Midnight Gospel feels like a dream, and like a dream, the story is really easy to follow, but also really weird to explain. I'll try my best to cover everything. Now, every episode is mostly its own contained story, but there is an ongoing arc and continuity, with there being many instances where something established in a previous episode will play a role in a later one. One really impressive example of this is in episode 6, where Clancy's computer malfunctions, and when he gets it fixed, Clancy is pissed that the computer never told him how to maintain it properly, but then the computer retorts that it tried to tell him all week. And if you pay attention to the earlier episodes, you'll notice that the computer actually was, in fact, doing that.
Master, I have something I need to show you over here. If I could just have a moment of your time.
Maybe in a second. I'm messing around with this new emoji pack I downloaded. It's badass. Look at that. Hey, why do all these planets have X's on them?
Because they are dying, as I am dying.
They're not dying. You're a machine.
Good morning, Master. Did you get a chance to read the Universe Simulator FAQ I left in your inbox?
Nope. Do you have a planet that has ice cream on it, like an ice cream world or something?
Master, I don't mean to nag, but simulator maintenance is actually very important for me not to wobble so that I continue to function properly.
Ice cream. There's got to be a planet with ice
Master,
cream.
I must insist.
Ask and you shall receive. Ice cream planet.
Master?
Let's do a quick ice cream scan.
Oh man, that's great. Also, every time Clancy exits the sim, he brings back a new pair of shoes, which you can see fill up his shelf as the series goes on. It's engaging to watch as things gradually unfold. We learn that Clancy moved to this acre of land and bought his simulator using a loan from his sister, who at first is peeved at him for taking her money and bouncing, but then she calls him on the phone during episode 6, where it's revealed that Clancy is using the sim to run away from his problems, and the screen starts flashing red to represent his escalating stress. And then in the finale, before Clancy shoots off to a distant sim planet, he's interrupted by the sudden appearance of his mother, which is spooky when you consider this line from the previous episode.
Well, it's kind of too late for me. Both my parents are friends of yours, I guess you could say.
And so his mother being here in the sim seems almost unreal or too good to be true. It's like a dream. Clancy steps into a younger version of himself, and then the two of them discuss life as they both gradually age throughout the talk, which escalates until his mom becomes too old and dies right in front of him. Next, Clancy gives birth. What? Yes. Which then leads to a role reversal where now Clancy is the adult and his mother is the growing child as they continue their conversation. And this dialogue becomes even more heartbreaking once you know the story behind it. As I've already explained, every episode of the show is based on an episode of the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast, and Duncan Trussell, of course, is one of the show creators and also plays Clancy. And so in this episode where Clancy talks to his mom, the person portraying her is actually Duncan Trussell's real mother before she passed away 7 years ago. And apparently she asked Duncan to be on his podcast only a few months before she passed.
That kind of brings us to the idea to something that you have been dealing with for 4 years now, which is that you have stage 4 bone cancer.
Metastatic breast cancer.
Metastatic breast cancer. And this is an extreme version of a tornado knocking a house down, because 4 years ago, you called to tell us that you had 6 months to live.
I have been told that at least a dozen times.
A dozen times that you've had 6 months to live.
I have been told to call a crematorium and find out how much it would cost to be cremated, because I had maybe a month or 6 weeks, and that I needed to know that so that I could pay the money up front before I died. And I have made the call to the crematorium, and I found out that it was $750. Thank you very much.
Wow. God, that is so fucked.
The possibility that there is some kind of force that will take us out when it's time to go out is nothing that I can do anything about.
This show isn't just nonsense from the outside looking in, there's a genuine heart to it. And given the source material, one could say that this is one of the realest shows out there, as everyone talks about real things, real ideas, and real events, which are ironically put to surreal animation in simulated worlds. And yet, even those simulated characters feel like real people thanks to the dialogue, because the dialogue is real. And the reason this episode is so effective is because you're able to relate to and understand the characters so well that when they go, it really hits.
You're a special case.
It's because I'm your mama.
No, I know this transfigure. I know, but come on. There's no way to stop the heartbreak. What do you do about that?
You cry. You cry.
And ironically, Clancy was avoiding his problems by literally escaping reality using the sim, but it was through the sim that he ended up getting probably the biggest reality check of his life, leaving him to ponder what it all means and how to deal with it without being able to run away, ending on a perfect, personal note. Or well, it would have been perfect. You see, in episode 3, Clancy gets a new subscriber named Daniel Hoops, who wants ice cream. So Clancy, the upstanding gent that he is, decides to send him some, which prompts Daniel's dad to walk in and beat the shit out of him before losing his mind and declaring all-out vengeance on Clancy for the crime of delivering an ice cream cone. So he doxes Clancy's goddamn information, sends the police to his house to smash all his stuff and burn it to the ground, all the while still tormenting Daniel, the poor guy. With all this bullshit resulting in Clancy almost getting shot, all the cops dying, sort of, it's complicated, and converting the entire area into a huge hazard space, all because of that unholy ice cream delivery.
I'm a good dad.
What a tool.
Yes, I've tricked you all. This is actually top 15 most hated characters. Number 1, this asshole. So anyway, while Clancy is in the middle of having a very emotional talk with his mother, Tart Baker Hoops interrupts it and trashes his house, causing Clancy to fall into his simulator, where it's speculated that he has ceased to be. But is Clancy really dead? Clancy fell into a universe simulator, meaning that it simulates an entire universe. Close to the end of the talk with his mother, the two of them manifest themselves in a planet being pulled into a large black hole, which then condenses and blows up after the simulator explodes in real life and becomes what's known as a wobble, which we learn from Captain Bryce form when a simulator becomes too unstable. And before the sim blows up, it emits purple smoke, just like the smoke we saw in episode 6 when Clancy's sim was breaking. Therefore, the black hole condensing and then exploding is likely symbolic of the simulator breaking down, and so by extension the simulated universe universe within it breaking down as well. And with all that in mind, it's possible that Clancy's escape route might not have actually saved his life, if the simulated universe is theoretically just as screwed as those cops. In the final scene, we see Clancy and his dog Scarlet get on a bus, and interestingly, this is the one true Clancy we're looking at and not an avatar, because all of the avatars have these nubby paw-like fingers, which we see Clancy have earlier in the episode. However, his hands are completely normal during all the scenes in the real world when Clancy is in the sim hub and this scene. Oh yeah, and Clancy is also missing the magic satchel that he always has with him while in the sim. And given that Scarlet is there too, who fell into the simulator along with Clancy, then it's clear that wherever they've ended up has some connection to reality, as in, it's not a dream or anything. Then when Clancy gets on the bus, we see many of the simulated people that he met over the course of his adventures, which could lead one to believe that this is one of those seeing familiar faces before crossing over type of deals. Heck, that's the kind of vibe the rest of the episode gave off, since Clancy's mother is supposed to be dead. But a more likely explanation is that all these sims have just glitched into the hub, kinda like what we saw in episode 5. Anyway, before Clancy takes his seat, he puts on his shoes for the episode. 2 spoons. He then looks up, and we see the spoon guy, which is concerning because the only other time we saw that guy was, again, in episode 5, when the prisoner Clancy was following would get killed and then go through rebirth. So the fact that he's here could very well mean that yes, Clancy has died. However, that doesn't mean he's lost. Remember, the only time we saw Spoon Guy was during a sequence of rebirth. So what if Clancy is actually in the process of being reborn in some way? The theme of this episode is birth after all, and when Clancy's mother died in this episode after growing too old, she was later reborn herself. Literally. And of course the prison is tied into this as well, since some of the sims we see on the bus were also in the prison. And Clancy's computer does tell us that anyone in the prison can't die, only be reborn, which could explain how all these sims survived the explosion. Somehow I think that episode 5 is the key to solving this whole thing. But of course, that's all conjecture. If only we had some real clues instead of just having to pick apart symbolism. Oh, I know, maybe the end credits song could give us a hint.
I am not alive, but I never die.
You know, I'm not too sure. Though, of course, we still don't know if Clancy even died in the first place, as the previous episode actually gives us evidence to the contrary.
Stop fighting it. You're gonna be okay. Face the void. Besides, you're not gonna die yet. That'll be on a rolly chair.
Rolly chair?
Yes, Death specifically tells Clancy that he'll die in that particular circumstance, meaning that, against all odds, there may in fact still be hope for Clancy, as the bus fades into the void and the season comes to a close. Now, of course, I'm not a fan of cliffhanger endings, but what are you gonna do? Though I do certainly hope Clancy makes it out of this somehow, since I feel that this concept is just way too good to leave it only 8 episodes. To put that into perspective, there are hundreds of episodes of the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast, some of which even feature returning guests that I could so vividly imagine being animated one day. Yeah, did you know, David actually appeared on the podcast like 7 times. But as for the 8 episodes we have so far, I could pick at little details for hours. Like in episode 3, the computer says it stayed up all night making new avatars for Clancy to try out, but then he just picks an avatar that he already had. Look, see? There it is in episode 1. Clancy's neighbor is missing a leg, but instead of getting, like, a prosthetic, he has one of his kids prop him up. In episode 5, every time the prisoner is reborn, they become a little more empathetic each time, eventually to the point of seeing themselves in the other prisoners. The way they animated David makes him look like he's made of water, since water is considered tranquil and relaxing. And of course, there's this moment that made me bust a gut laughing because I just wasn't prepared for it.
But the Tibetans, how they approach it, love means how happy you can make another person.
What the fuck? That kid just took my eyeball.
Clancy is a character I find so relatable. He often talks about becoming successful off his space cast, even though he only has like 18 subscribers, which I find so endearing. He tries to maintain this chill attitude through his laid-back slacker lifestyle, yet still gets realistically annoyed by minor inconveniences. And of course, Clancy's voice actor plays him very well. But on that note, is Clancy actually his real name? On at least 3 different occasions, Clancy's guests call him Duncan, which of course is the name of his voice actor Duncan Trussell, and is the case since he uses his real name in his podcast, which this show is based on. This happens for the first time in episode 2.
Thank you, Annie.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Duncan.
You're welcome.
This is like
Thank you. Are you kidding? I can't believe I get to be here.
favorite people. I'm lucky.
Thank you.
So lucky.
Thank you. Duncan? Who's Duncan?
From this, it's made clear that Clancy doesn't recognize that name, so it probably isn't something where Duncan is his middle name or Clancy is his nickname or something like that. And if it had stopped there, I probably would have just called it an Easter egg, since it's not uncommon for creators to feature themselves somewhere in their work. But in this show, it happens frequently enough to rule that possibility out. It happens again in episode 6.
Yes. You see Duncan.
Clancy.
Oh, okay.
And then in the finale, Clancy's mother calls him Duncan multiple times. But this time, Clancy isn't confused or even attempts to correct her. And he's just like, yes, that is my name. I don't see any problem here. Which makes me wonder if this was something that the crew just had to roll with since they couldn't change some of this audio, or if there's some kind of deeper meaning to it all. Because in the Netflix subtitles for this episode, Clancy is actually referred to as Duncan. Whatever this is supposed to mean, I am not certain of. Unless, of course, they're setting up some kind of 4D plot twist where the entire show is just Duncan Trussell wearing a VR headset while high on marijuana. Wouldn't surprise me, especially when you remember that the first episode was actually about weed and other drugs, and that the show was released on April 20th, also known as 420, which is slang for weed, but is also creator Duncan Trussell's real-life birthday, which is also the real-life birthday of Adolf Hitler. So yeah, to wrap up, if you're not too fond of podcasts, or realist art, or quasi-philosophical ramblings like I am, then this show probably isn't for you. And if you're still on the fence, I'd recommend at least checking out episode 1 to see if it jives with you, as I feel it's a great showcase of what you can expect from the rest of the series. And while there were a handful of things I took issue with, I wouldn't really call any of the episodes bad. Except episode 4. Skip it maybe. And while we're at it, I'd also recommend you check out the Duncan Trussell Family Hour website, which I'll link to in the description. On it, you'll find every episode of the podcast, including the ones that were used in this show. So I guess if you're bored or Animal Crossing is just a bit too plain, then this would be great to have on in the background. And if you're only interested in hearing the episodes that they used for the show, you can find them easily by going to the Midnight Gospel tab and selecting the episode you're curious about. And this tab also lists podcast episodes featuring a few of the show's staff, including Pendleton Ward, who co-created the show along with Duncan, and who was actually the one who suggested that the podcast be adapted into an animated series in the first place, because, quote, Trussell had the ability to make 2 hours of meditation conversation funny, and I'd say that it really worked out in the long run because there is no other cartoon like the Midnight Gospel.
With the sorrow in our hearts we can play, and I look up to you, and we hear different sounds than the heartless do. Wakeful at night, looking everywhere for you.
And so you have to wear contacts. And I've never really experienced this problem before, but fortunately my wife, Clancy, is has really terrible vision. It's just been described as the vision of a mole, kind of an underground subterranean thing. And so she's got to wear contact lenses.
Why do